Imagine a sprawling Virginia estate in the 1830s. Whitewashed walls, candlelit windows glowing long into the night, a family of landowners so respected that their word outweighed that of judges, preachers, and merchants alike. To neighbors, the Hollowells were models of piety and wealth, men who shook hands in the town square and bowed their heads in Sunday pews. But behind those walls, behind the cellar doors bolted from the outside, lay a secret that would shatter the illusion of Southern gentility forever. This was no ordinary farm. It was a prison, a carefully engineered system of cruelty, where boys were stolen, traded, and reduced to entries in ledgers like cattle, a dynasty that masked its darkness with public generosity. And when the truth finally came to light, it wasn't just the Hollowell family's legacy that crumbled. It was the community itself. Because if such evil could hide in plain sight, what did that say about the men who chose to look away? Before we dive deeper, take a moment to hit. Like if stories like this pull you in, and subscribe so you never miss the hidden histories others are too afraid to tell. Share this with someone who thinks they know America's past. Because trust me, after hearing the Hollowell story, they'll never look at the Old South the same way again. The Hollowell estate stood like a monument on Virginia soil, its whitewashed fences gleaming in sunlight, its sprawling acres whispering prosperity. Yet beneath the polished veneer, rumors drifted like smoke through the countryside, carried by uneasy tongues. Farmhands working nearby fields spoke of wagons rolling down dirt roads long after midnight, their wheels muffled beneath thick cloth. The men swore those carts carried more than tools or grain, but dared not name what. Some boys lingering too close to the property claimed they heard faint cries carried on the wind. They described voices that did not belong to any man, but smaller, weaker, desperately pleading in the night. When these tales reached fathers in taverns or along church steps, most dismissed them as childish imagination. To accuse the Hollowells, men of wealth and influence, seemed absurd, even dangerous. Silence offered safety, while whispers carried risk. The Hollowell family presented themselves as paragons. Ezra Hollowell, the patriarch, shook hands with judges, donated to the parish, and stood proudly in church pews. His sons walked the town square with confidence, untouchable in their respectability. But appearances could not silence suspicion forever. One winter, a boy no older than 10 staggered into a neighboring village. His clothes were torn, his body bruised, his eyes wild with hunger and terror. At first, men assumed he was a runaway from a poor household. But when food was placed before him, he devoured it with a desperation so raw that grown men looked away, unsettled by the sight. When the boy regained enough strength to speak, fragments of his ordeal spilled out. He spoke of locked doors, barred windows, and other boys like him kept in chambers where light rarely reached. He described narrow rooms with straw-covered floors, bolts fastened from the outside, and nights filled with muffled sobs. Sometimes a boy vanished, taken without explanation, and the silence afterward felt heavier than screams. What shook listeners most was his account of the cellar. He spoke of descending steps carved into earth, where air reeked of rot and chains rattled in the dark. He remembered voices fading into sudden silence. Some men dismissed his words as the delirium of a frightened child. But his wounds, his hunger, his trembling fear were undeniable. Those who heard him felt the weight of truth pressing against their hearts. One minister, remembering a forgotten letter from a servant who once fled the Hollowell house, recognized the boy's story. The details matched. Corridors forbidden, doors locked from outside, and warnings never to approach the cellar. For years, that letter had been dismissed, hidden away out of doubt or fear. But now, in the boy's voice, its meaning sharpened. 2 testimonies from 2 different souls pointed to the same darkness. The constable, reluctant yet uneasy, began making notes. He dared not accuse the Hollowells directly. Men of such standing could ruin reputations with a single word. Instead, he ordered quiet observation, a watch kept from afar. Villagers gathered in hushed groups, their eyes drawn toward the Hollowell estate. They counted wagons moving at odd hours, noted missing children whose fathers never saw them return, and felt dread whenever the house loomed against dusk. Fear, however, bound their tongues. To confront the Hollowells was to risk ridicule, perhaps worse. Wealth could shield cruelty, and silence offered protection. Yet beneath that silence, suspicion grew like roots through hard soil. The boys' testimony lingered in minds, retold in whispers by firelight. Some men swore they saw movement behind shuttered windows, shapes too small to belong to grown men, but quickly swallowed again by shadow. One evening, a farmer traveling past the estate claimed he heard faint tapping, like knuckles against wood. He urged his horse forward, but long after, the sound haunted him, echoing in restless dreams. The Hollowell sons walked with heads high, greeting merchants and clergymen as though nothing lay beneath their roofs but comfort. Their confidence made suspicion feel dangerous, even treacherous. Yet cracks in certainty had already begun forming. Late in autumn, a wagon overturned on an icy bend near the estate. Villagers rushed to help the injured driver, only to find beneath the canvas strange wooden restraints stained with something darker than livestock blood. The sight chilled every man present. They covered the load as the servant begged, his voice breaking, insisting his life would be forfeit if the discovery reached the wrong ears. Fear sealed the moment in silence. Word spread quickly, but explanations followed just as fast. The Hollowells claimed the equipment was for training unruly animals. Many nodded outwardly, yet inside, each man knew no beast required chains shaped for wrists. The contradictions piled higher with each season. Generous donations to churches, lavish feasts for visiting officials. Yet wagons rolled by moonlight, children disappeared without trace, and silence grew harder for fathers to bear. Still, the Hollowells seemed untouchable. Their wealth bought loyalty, their piety bought trust, and their hospitality bought blindness. To challenge them felt like standing against the tide itself, an act destined for ruin. But truth has a way of clawing upward, even through stone. The boy's voice, the servant's letter, and the wagon's secret combined into a story that would not stay buried. Suspicion became a quiet rebellion. Men began keeping their own notes. When wagons entered, when they left, which children failed to return from errands, which workers vanished after stepping too close to the Hollowell gates. A ledger of whispers took shape. By firelight, fathers compared accounts. Patterns emerged too precise to dismiss. Deliveries aligned with disappearances. Nights of candlelight in Hollowell windows matched cries heard in the fields. The weight of coincidence grew too heavy. One brave man, unable to endure silence, crept close enough to the estate one midnight to see shadows in an upper window. He swore he saw a boy's hand press briefly against the glass. The image tormented him. He told no constable, fearing dismissal, but confided to neighbors. The description matched tales told by the escaped boy. It was proof enough to harden suspicion into grim conviction. The Hollowells carried themselves with unbroken pride, but the ground beneath them trembled with unease. Men no longer admired their wealth so easily. Each handshake felt colder, each word weighed heavier with hidden doubt. The village itself changed. Fathers who once let their sons wander fields began keeping them close. Doors were locked earlier, lanterns burned later. The shadow of the estate stretched longer than its walls, and always the whispers grew. They slithered through taverns, barns, and fields, painting a picture too dark to ignore. The Hollowell name, once spoken with respect, now carried the taste of suspicion on men's tongues. By the early 1830s, unease had hardened into quiet fear. The Hollowell farm no longer seemed like a neighbor's estate, but like a fortress hiding something foul. Men began to wonder who else knew. The boy's memory, fractured though it was, lingered like a wound. He spoke often of the cellar, the smell, the chains, the voices silenced too suddenly. His words gave shape to the community's darkest fears. The constable still delayed, torn between duty and survival. Each passing season allowed the Hollowells to move freely, but each whisper, each note, drew the truth closer. The estate's mask of prosperity was thinning. Fathers swore to one another that when the truth emerged, it would not be rumor, but revelation. And until then, they would watch, waiting for the moment when silence could no longer hold. In the end, it was not law or scripture that kept the Hollowells safe, but fear. Fear that to accuse them meant ruin, fear that their reach extended deeper than anyone dared imagine. But fear breeds defiance, too. And in the hollow silence of the fields, in the uneasy glances of men who had lost sons, the first seeds of resistance against the Hollowells began to grow. The whispers became threads, weaving into a tapestry of suspicion that blanketed the countryside. And as nights grew longer and colder, the men who lived in those shadows understood one truth. They were waiting for a crack. The Hollowell estate stood unchanged, proud and polished. Yet behind shuttered windows and bolted cellars, the truth stirred. It was only a matter of time before whispers erupted into discovery, and discovery into horror. By day, the Hollowells embodied virtue. Ezra walked among merchants with the steady stride of a man untouchable by rumor. His sons spoke confidently in the town square, offering handshakes and lending coin when others faltered. Men praised their generosity. The Hollowells funded parish repairs, donated to poor households, and hosted feasts that brought together magistrates and tradesmen alike. To accuse such benefactors of cruelty seemed absurd, even sacrilegious. Respectability shielded them like armor. The Hollowells' new appearances were their strongest weapon. Ezra cultivated the image of a righteous patriarch, his sons bowing their heads in prayer every Sunday. Their land produced profit, and their piety projected purity. But beneath this polished image lay calculation. Their every gesture of kindness doubled as camouflage. A coin to a struggling farmer silenced suspicion. A meal for a magistrate bought loyalty. Each act performed in daylight buried secrets in shadow. Visitors to the Hollowell farmhouse described long tables laden with food, silver polished to brilliance, and laughter echoing through spacious halls. Yet behind locked doors, rooms stood silent, holding truths no guest would ever see. The contradiction baffled men who whispered rumors. How could a family so devout, so visibly generous, harbor darkness? It seemed impossible, and impossibility became its own defense. Reputation became their shield against suspicion. Ezra understood the currency of perception. He ensured the Hollowell name appeared in every church ledger, every community gathering, every town celebration. The more visible their charity, the less anyone dared question what hid behind walls. One evening, a merchant recounted how Ezra had forgiven a large debt after a poor harvest. The story spread quickly, sealing his image as a man of compassion. Few considered what price such kindness concealed. The Hollowell sons played their parts well. They escorted visiting officials across fields, pointing proudly at livestock and harvests. They laughed heartily, offered cigars, and spoke of scripture, every gesture carefully rehearsed to project virtue. Yet whispers never ceased entirely. A farmhand claimed he heard metallic clanging at night, too deliberate to be animals. Another man swore he glimpsed unfamiliar faces vanish behind shutters. Such words rarely spread beyond taverns. The Hollowells countered doubt with visibility. When questioned about wagons moving late at night, Ezra explained them as shipments of grain. When asked about shuttered windows, he claimed sick workers rested within. His answers sounded convincing. The parish priest often praised Ezra's devotion, recalling his generous tithes. Each Sunday, men saw the family kneel solemnly, heads bowed. That image, so public and constant, made dissenters appear like slanderers. Doubt was smothered. Meanwhile, the Hollowell estate thrived. Barns gleamed with fresh paint, fences stood strong, and fields stretched fertile. Neighbors admired the prosperity, often forgetting that surface beauty could mask rot spreading beneath the soil. Behind closed doors, the family maintained rigid control. Keys hung heavy on belts, doors locked from outside, and cellars barred with iron. Yet these precautions were invisible to guests sipping wine in candlelit parlors. Men invited to dine at Hollowell tables left impressed by abundance. They described meat cooked to perfection, laughter spilling across polished floors, and Ezra's eloquence in prayer. The performance left no room for suspicion. But cracks existed. A constable once noticed a Hollowell son's sleeve stained faintly with something dark, quickly explained away as ink. Another visitor heard muffled thuds upstairs, brushed off as servants moving furniture. The Hollowells excelled at turning doubt into ridicule. When whispers reached them, they laughed, dismissing tales as superstition. Their allies repeated such dismissals, shaming those who dared speak against respected men of stature. The mask of respectability grew heavier with each passing year. To uphold it required endless calculation, endless acts of charity. But it worked. Men feared more to accuse than to believe their own ears. Still, whispers clung stubbornly. Fathers who had lost sons kept watchful eyes. They remembered wagons seen at midnight, the bruised boy's testimony, the stench of chains described. Beneath admiration, suspicion lived, silent but unforgotten. The Hollowells tightened their grip further. Ezra offered loans at generous terms, ensuring debtors stayed loyal. He invited magistrates to hunt on his land, binding them with camaraderie. Influence expanded as suspicion was buried. One evening, a magistrate remarked publicly that Ezra was a pillar among men. That phrase traveled quickly, repeated like scripture. It sealed the Hollowell image so firmly that challenging it seemed like blasphemy. But the mask required constant reinforcement. When one rumor grew louder, the family answered with new charity, new gifts, new gestures of generosity. Each kindness was calculated, not spontaneous, a weapon sharper than any blade. Inside the estate, order reigned with chilling precision. Sons followed Ezra's commands without hesitation. Every servant was sworn to silence, bound by fear. The structure mirrored not a home, but an institution disguised as one. At times, faint cries were overheard by workers laboring near the estate's edge. They exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. To speak was to risk everything. To stay silent was to survive. The Hollowells rewarded loyalty lavishly. Men who praised them publicly received grain, livestock, or coin. Those who whispered too boldly found their debts called in, their fields left unsupported. Power was enforced with velvet gloves. The estate's reputation grew legendary. Travelers passing through heard tales of Hollowell wealth, their feasts, their generosity. Outsiders carried away admiration, further insulating the family. No visitor ever stayed long enough to see beneath. Ezra reveled in this myth. Each handshake, each prayer, each coin dropped into a beggar's palm layered another brick into the fortress of perception. His enemies were not other men, but suspicion itself. Yet men who watched closely saw inconsistencies. Deliveries explained as grain smelled faintly metallic. Horses pulling wagons bore whip marks unusual for ordinary work. And always, the Hollowell windows glowed late into the night. Some questioned why a household of men required so many locked rooms. Ezra's answer was simple. Valuables needed protection, study required privacy, servants needed order. His voice carried such authority that few dared challenge further. The Hollowells were masters of performance, actors upon a stage where the audience was their own community. Each gesture reinforced the script. Each whisper of doubt was drowned beneath the thunder of public approval. Still, silence cracked in private moments. Fathers with missing sons whispered to neighbors, comparing stories. Workers counted wagons. Constables hesitated over reports, but tucked them away uneasily. Beneath the mask, truth clawed, hungry for light. The Hollowell sons bore their roles with practiced ease. They stood tall, confident, smiling when required, stern when useful. Their composure became armor, each expression forged to deflect suspicion and invite admiration. Yet the performance grew brittle. Rumors persisted, louder with each disappearance. And though respectability still shielded them, the first fractures in their carefully built facade threatened to spread like cracks through polished marble. What unsettled men most was the thought that evil could cloak itself so well in virtue. If the Hollowells were not what they seemed, then how many others walked behind such masks? This duality haunted the village. Admiration in daylight, whispers at night. Respect in public, suspicion in private. The Hollowell mask endured, but those who looked closely began to see its edges fraying. The Hollowell name, once spoken with reverence, now carried an undertone of unease. Respectability could not hold forever. For every feast, every handshake, every prayer, shadows deepened. And shadows, once thick enough, always reveal what they conceal. The Hollowell's mask of generosity held firm for years. But suspicion is like water against stone, slow, steady, unstoppable. Each whisper, each disappearance, each unexplained delivery chipped away at the family's carefully constructed illusion. Men who once praised Ezra Hollowell began keeping silent when his name was raised. Their admiration was tempered by unease, by unspoken knowledge that something beneath his polished reputation did not align with reality. A farmer swore he saw a young boy's face vanish behind shuttered windows one night. He kept the memory hidden, ashamed of doubt, but shared it eventually with a trusted neighbor in whispers. Other fathers, haunted by missing sons, began connecting details. Deliveries arriving late, children never returning from errands, wagons slipping down dirt paths under moonlight. Coincidences grew too many, and silence became unbearable for some. The constable, already uneasy from the boy's testimony, received more reports he could not dismiss. Men came quietly, offering fragments, cries at night, unusual wagons, bruised strangers glimpsed in fields. Each account deepened suspicion. The most damning evidence emerged from a ledger discovered in a shed near the estate. Scrawled entries cataloged supplies, but among them were cryptic notes: arrival, condition, transfer. Words that echoed the boy's testimony. The constable studied the ledger by lamplight, heart pounding. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, almost clerical. It did not record chaos, but order, an order that suggested system, planning, and a cruelty masked as commerce. When news of the ledger spread, men debated in hushed tones whether it was genuine. Some dismissed it as fabrication. Others, remembering vanished sons, recognized it as truth too sharp to ignore. The Hollowell sons continued walking proudly through town, but their footsteps drew fewer greetings. Merchants exchanged polite nods without warmth. Judges smiled thinly, suspicion tucked behind formality. Respect remained, but trust eroded like rotting timber. Cracks widened further after another wagon overturned in a ditch, revealing restraints stained darker than animal use. Witnesses knew what they saw, and though silence followed, belief in the Hollowells' innocence weakened permanently. Men whispered that the Hollowells' influence reached further than the village. Too many missing reports vanished from records. Too many officials looked the other way. Corruption seemed tied to the family's iron grip. The constable, pressured from all sides, began compiling testimonies secretly. He scribbled notes in the margins of his books, names, dates, and disappearances. Though terrified, he knew the evidence was growing too heavy to bury. One night, a villager crept close to the estate and heard chains dragging across stone. He fled in panic, but the sound followed him into sleep, a nightmare made flesh, gnawing at his mind. Another man swore he saw a servant carrying buckets from the cellar, his shoulders straining. The buckets smelled foul, like rot. When questioned, the servant grew pale and stammered, then vanished days later. The Hollowells countered suspicion with intensified charity. Ezra donated more coin, his sons entertained more officials. Yet each act of generosity now seemed hollow, painted too brightly, a performance stretched thin against mounting shadows. By then, fathers with missing sons gathered privately, trading accounts of suspicion. They compared ledgers, testimonies, and sightings. For the first time, men dared to voice aloud what whispers had long suggested. This was no accident. The Hollowell estate was not simply eccentric or secretive. It was a prison, a fortress of cruelty disguised as a farm. The conclusion felt inevitable, though terrifying. To accuse them openly meant courting destruction. Still, cracks could not be sealed. The boy's voice echoed through taverns. The servant's letter resurfaced. The ledger existed, and wagons betrayed their secrets. The facade, no matter how polished, was failing. Men once loyal to Ezra grew distant. Neighbors avoided his son's handshakes, nodding curtly before turning away. In every glance, suspicion replaced admiration. The Hollowell mask, though intact, showed fractures visible to anyone watching closely. In taverns, heated arguments erupted. Some defended the Hollowells fiercely, insisting generosity outweighed rumor. Others pounded tables, demanding action, voices trembling with grief for missing sons. The village was splitting, unity collapsing under suspicion. The constable faced growing pressure. Each night, he stared at the ledger hidden beneath his desk. Every line whispered of cruelty, yet fear of consequence shackled his hand. He feared both truth and silence. Ezra sensed the change. He doubled efforts to maintain image, speaking louder in church, donating more lavishly, hosting grander feasts. But men noticed the strain in his smile, the cracks spreading beneath composure. Even allies whispered doubts privately. A magistrate, once a staunch defender, admitted unease after glimpsing small shoes in a corridor during a Hollowell feast. He told no one officially, but the memory lingered, damning. The Hollowell sons grew harsher, their charm slipping. When questioned lightly by merchants, their replies carried edge. Men whispered they saw anger flash in their eyes, masks slipping momentarily before snapping back in place. The village itself began to change. Fathers forbade sons from venturing near Hollowell fields. Doors bolted earlier. Torches burned later. Suspicion seeped into every household, gnawing at what little peace remained. The Hollowells tightened their grip. They increased patrols around their estate, sent servants to monitor taverns, and spread counter-rumors about jealous neighbors. Yet their efforts felt desperate, like men bailing water from a sinking ship. For the first time, silence no longer protected them completely. Too many cracks, too many witnesses, too many fathers whispering their suspicions into the ears of constables who could no longer look away. The ledger passed secretly between trusted hands, each man adding notes, cross-referencing names, connecting patterns. It became the community's weapon, a quiet rebellion written in ink, each line a blow against Hollowell power. The Hollowells sensed this shift. Ezra's prayers grew louder, his voice booming in church, his hand trembling faintly as he raised it. His sons watched villagers with narrowed eyes, their confidence cracking under suspicion. Fear lingered thick as fog, but beneath it, anger stirred. Fathers whispered promises of vengeance. Laborers spoke of defiance. Whispers transformed into something heavier, more dangerous, resolve. The Hollowell name no longer carried unquestioned reverence. The cracks in the facade widened daily. Each rumor, each testimony, each note in the ledger became a fracture, splintering the Hollowell's carefully built mask. And once masks begin breaking, they rarely mend again. The estate still gleamed white under sun, its fences standing proud, its windows glowing warmly. But every man who saw it now imagined chains beneath, shadows behind glass, and voices crying where no one listened. Even silence betrayed the Hollowells. The absence of laughter in fields, the absence of ordinary noise from barns, the eerie stillness of night, all spoke louder than Ezra's prayers or his son's handshakes. The village stood on the edge of revelation. The Hollowell's mask of respectability still held, but it was cracking, splintering, threatening collapse. And when it finally shattered, what lay beneath would horrify beyond imagining. The Hollowells continued their performance, smiling, donating, praying, but suspicion no longer slept. The community watched with sharpened eyes, whispering louder, comparing notes, waiting for the inevitable. For facades, once fractured, cannot endure forever. And so, the Hollowells' fate crept closer. Not with thunder or sudden storm, but with whispers turned to voices, voices turned to demands, and demands turning inevitably into confrontation. The cracks could not be hidden. The Hollowell estate had long been a fortress of whispers, but no rumor compared to what waited beneath its floorboards. For years, the cellar existed only in fearful stories, a place spoken of cautiously. When the sheriff finally arrived with deputies, pressure from fathers and neighbors weighed heavily on him. Reluctant though he was, he knew silence had ended. The time had come to descend into truth. The Hollowells greeted officials with polished calm. Ezra offered wine, his sons stood silently beside him, and servants moved politely. On the surface, everything resembled hospitality, but tension in the air revealed another story. The sheriff requested access to the shed rumored to conceal a stairwell. Ezra hesitated, exchanging a quick glance with his sons, but finally relented. His voice carried smooth authority, though unease flickered in his eyes. The deputies pried open the heavy door. A rush of air, damp and foul, escaped upward. The stench silenced every man present. A mixture of rot, mold, and something unmistakably human in its suffering. Lanterns were lit. Boots clattered on stone as men descended cautiously, shadows stretching across rough-hewn walls. The deeper they moved, the heavier the air became, pressing against lungs like invisible weight, each breath reluctant and strained. At the bottom, the cellar revealed itself. Chains hung from beams overhead, rusted and scarred with use. Straw mats lined the ground, dark stains seeping into their fibers. Silence pressed thick, broken only by breathing. Then movement. Behind a barred gate, huddled figures stirred. Boys, thin and trembling, their eyes wide against the sudden light. Some shielded their faces, others reached forward, voices cracking as they whispered for help. The sheriff froze, his chest heavy. Deputies exchanged pale looks, uncertain whether to step closer. When one extended a hand, a boy clutched it desperately, knuckles white, as though life itself depended on the grip. The gate was unbarred. The boys recoiled at first, mistrusting kindness after years of cruelty. But slowly, one by one, they stepped forward. Lantern light revealed bruises, scars, and gaunt faces hollowed by hunger. As deputies led them upward, villagers waiting outside gasped. Fathers covered mouths, some whispered prayers, others clenched fists in anger. The truth had surfaced, undeniable, stripping the Hollowell family of its carefully crafted facade. But the horror did not end there. Behind one wall, deputies noticed deliberate carvings. A false partition collapsed beneath force, revealing a tunnel sloping deeper, its air thick with chemicals and decay. The descent continued. Inside this second chamber stood a wooden table scarred with deep cuts. Leather restraints dangled from its sides. Shelves along the walls held jars, broken glass, and remnants of experiments that no farmer could explain. A ledger rested nearby. Its pages cataloged boys by number, not name, with chilling precision. Dates of arrival, conditions, and cryptic notes like unfit or transferred. The words read like inventory, not human life. Deputies trembled as they turned the pages. Each line confirmed that this was no accident, no moment of madness. It was systematized cruelty, designed, maintained, and hidden beneath the illusion of prosperity and piety. Back above ground, villagers pressed close as news spread of deeper chambers. Men shook their heads in disbelief, whispering that their worst fears had been outmatched by reality. The Hollowell farm was no farm. It was machinery, designed for exploitation. A house above for appearances, chambers below for cruelty. Ezra stood silently, hands clasped behind his back, his calm demeanor more chilling than if he had shouted denials. The sheriff ordered further searches. Floorboards were lifted, trapdoors uncovered, false walls pried open. Each revelation painted the estate not as home, but labyrinth, where every brick and beam contributed to a prison. Servants were questioned, though most trembled too much to speak. A few muttered warnings describing long nights of carrying buckets, hauling supplies, and silencing cries. Their fear was palpable, their silence already purchased by terror. Among villagers, anger replaced whispers. Fathers clenched fists, vowing no more silence. Men spat when the Hollowell name was spoken, voices raw with grief and rage. The discovery ignited emotions long buried under fear. The sheriff, though shaken, pressed deeper into tunnels. He found chambers lined with shelving, contracts hidden in crates, and coded correspondence suggesting the Hollowells were not alone. The cruelty stretched wider than their estate. A sense of betrayal spread through the county. Men realized they had dined at Hollowell tables, accepted Hollowell coin, and praised Hollowell piety, all while boys were chained beneath the very floors they admired. The church bell tolled not in celebration, but in mourning. Men knelt, heads bowed, whispering prayers through clenched teeth. The revelation was too large for silence, too heavy to bear without desperate words to heaven. The sheriff knew the truth could not be buried again. The cellar existed, the boys lived, the ledger spoke. Every father in the county now had proof that whispers had always carried weight, and still, deeper tunnels hinted at more. Deputies found diagrams etched faintly on stone, directions for expansions. The Hollowells had designed their cruelty with foresight, building not merely cells but infrastructure for a network. The thought unsettled every man. This was not confined to one estate. The ledger spoke of transfers, shipments, initials of other men. The cracks revealed not just one family, but perhaps many standing behind them. As deputies carried boys out into cold autumn air, villagers gathered to watch. Fathers wept openly, tears streaking hardened faces. They saw not strangers, but reminders of their own sons, lost to silence. The Hollowells were led away under guard. Ezra walked without protest, his calm unnerving. His sons followed, faces expressionless. Their silence felt heavier than words, as though they trusted influence to protect them still. The sheriff sealed the estate, declaring it a crime scene. Yet even as boards nailed shut, villagers whispered that the ground itself seemed tainted, the soil poisoned by the years of cruelty buried below. The boys rescued from the cellar struggled to speak. Some whispered fragments, others sat silently, eyes unfocused. Their presence was enough, testimony written not in words but in scars across small, frail bodies. The community gathered, sharing grief and fury. Fathers vowed justice, deputies promised further searches, and the sheriff prepared to present findings. For the first time, suspicion transformed into undeniable truth, too powerful to silence. The cellar's revelation became legend overnight. No feast, no coin, no prayer could mask what was uncovered. Respectability collapsed, replaced by outrage. The Hollowell name became a curse spoken through clenched jaws and bitter spit. And yet, men whispered of what lay deeper still. Not every chamber had been searched, not every ledger read. The horror uncovered was vast, but perhaps only the surface of something greater. The sheriff felt the weight of it all. The cellar had spoken, but the story was not finished. The Hollowells were not merely cruel, they were part of a machine built in shadow. Every man knew the truth then. The mask was gone, the facade shattered, the cellar revealed. And what began as whispers in fields had erupted into revelation, burning through silence like fire in dry wood. The Hollowell estate no longer stood as a monument to wealth, but as a monument to cruelty. And though men now saw the truth, they also feared what further horrors lay still hidden. The descent into the cellar had changed everything. The Hollowells were unmasked, the boys freed, the ledger discovered. Yet the questions it raised would haunt the county, twisting trust and leaving shadows in every corner. Because if one respected family could build such cruelty beneath their floors, who else might hide secrets beneath polished walls, smiling faces, and generous hands? The revelation was only the beginning, not the end. The discovery of the Hollowell cellar should have ended the story, but instead it opened a wider wound. The ledger spoke of shipments, initials, and transfers, suggesting powerful men beyond the estate were involved. The sheriff pored over the entries by lamplight. Each line carried a chilling precision, recording not just boys, but movements, conditions, and payments. His deputies whispered uneasily, realizing this was not isolated cruelty, it was commerce. The word transferred appeared most often. Where were these boys sent? Which hands received them? Each cryptic note hinted at a network, deliberate and far-reaching, spreading far beyond the borders of the Hollowell farm. Men in the county whispered about allies hidden in plain sight. Merchants, judges, landowners, figures respected by the community might have profited quietly, smiling by day while enabling horrors beneath shadows. Distrust spread through taverns and streets. Evidence soon confirmed suspicion. A barn on the neighboring Carter property revealed crates marked with initials. Inside were shoes, blankets, and sealed envelopes stuffed with coin. The connection between Hollowells and Carters became undeniable overnight. When confronted, Thomas Carter stammered excuses, insisting ignorance. Yet his trembling hands betrayed guilt. Villagers muttered angrily, realizing respected neighbors had stood side by side with the Hollowells in this hidden enterprise. Loyalty crumbled into rage. More discoveries followed. Warehouses along the river held crates stamped with strange symbols, interlaced triangles scorched into wood. Ledgers inside tracked payments, shipments, and coded initials. The operation stretched far wider than one family's estate. Men in town realized their community had been feeding a hidden machine. Merchants they trusted, judges they obeyed, landowners they respected, any of them could be entangled. Whispers of complicity hung like a storm cloud overhead. The sheriff faced a dangerous truth. Justice could not stop at the Hollowell gates. To pursue further meant striking at pillars of the county, men of stature whose influence shielded them from scrutiny. Fear spread faster than outrage. Fathers whispered about judges protecting traffickers. Deputies questioned whether law itself had been poisoned. If leaders were complicit, where could truth survive? Who among them remained untouched by corruption? Suspicion seeped everywhere. A banker's sudden wealth was questioned. A magistrate's hesitation grew suspicious. Each act of hesitation, each unexplained coin, carried weight. Men studied one another with narrowed eyes, searching for signs of guilt. The ledger became their weapon. Names hidden behind initials began to take shape as patterns matched dates of disappearances and known associates. Each revelation tightened the net, exposing respected men as predators in disguise. But with each revelation came danger. The sheriff received threats, notes left on his door marked with strange symbols. Deputies were followed at night, their families stalked by riders whose faces vanished into the dark. Retaliation soon escalated. Fires consumed barns that had once hidden evidence. Records vanished in flames, erasing trails. The network struck swiftly, destroying proof before it could be read. Each blaze reminded the county of unseen power. Fear split the community. Some fathers begged the sheriff to stop, fearing more bloodshed. Others demanded he push forward, voices trembling with anger. The county stood on a knife's edge between justice and ruin. The sheriff gathered his deputies in secret. He reminded them that silence had protected the Hollowells for years. To falter now meant condemning future sons. His words carried weight, though fear still darkened faces. In taverns, men spoke bitterly of betrayal. They realized the very system meant to protect them. Courts, merchants, churches might have harbored predators. Outrage mixed with despair. Trust, once the foundation of community, cracked irreparably. Ezra Hollowell remained silent in custody. His composure unnerved deputies. His sons refused to speak as well, their eyes distant, as though they believed allies outside still held power enough to save them. The sheriff pressed harder. Raids expanded across the county. Crates, contracts, and correspondence surfaced in barns, warehouses, and even parlor cupboards. Each find connected another respected man to the ledger's cruel architecture of commerce. Soon, the conspiracy stretched into neighboring counties. A map drawn from documents revealed routes leading to river docks, connecting to shipping lanes reaching distant cities. The machine was larger than anyone dared imagine. Villagers spoke in hushed fear. If the Hollowells were a single spoke, then the wheel turned elsewhere as well. Each discovery suggested new names, new ties, and deeper betrayal hidden within respectable facades. The sheriff confided only in trusted deputies. Even within law, he feared corruption. A single leak could undo everything. Secrecy became survival, each man carrying notes close to chest, trusting no one beyond brotherhood. But secrecy did not shield them from consequence. Deputies were attacked on country roads, their farms burned, their families threatened. Blood was shed quietly, meant as warning. The network fought to preserve itself with violence. One deputy's body was found in a ditch, throat cut cleanly, badge pinned cruelly to chest. The funeral drew the entire town. Fathers clenched fists, rage spreading. Complicity was no longer rumor. It was war. The sheriff swore retaliation. He told the community that no man, however respected, would be spared if proven guilty. His words echoed in church halls, drawing applause from some, fear from others. Meanwhile, distrust deepened. Merchants eyed judges with suspicion. Farmers refused to trade with certain men. The county fractured, suspicion dividing neighbors. Each glance carried weight, each silence accused. The network thrived on this disunity. Still, evidence accumulated. Contracts detailed payments hidden as donations, receipts matched ledger initials, crates tied to multiple estates. The machine was unraveling, each thread pulled exposing another name, another betrayal, another man guilty of silence. The sheriff discovered a ledger linking shipments to Charles Whitlock, a wealthy landowner whose influence spanned courts, commerce, and docks. His initials matched transactions corresponding with disappearances across multiple states. The conspiracy had a face. Whitlock's reputation was unblemished. He hosted fairs, funded schools, and dined with judges. To accuse him meant declaring war on the county's very foundation. Yet the ledger tied him directly to Hollowell cruelty. The sheriff wrestled with the weight of decision. To strike against Whitlock risked destruction, but to delay risked erasure of truth. His deputies urged caution, but silence felt heavier, more dangerous than action. In secret, the sheriff devised a trap. False whispers spread that federal officials already reviewed the ledger. Panic followed. Whitlock's allies burned papers, moved coin, and betrayed unease. Their fear revealed guilt more than words. Spies reported Whitlock gathering allies at his estate, planning to discredit the sheriff. It was proof of involvement, but also proof of power. The sheriff knew confrontation was inevitable, and the stakes deadly. In candlelit rooms, the sheriff traced connections, circling initials, linking names to shipments, mapping betrayal across counties. His jaw tightened with each line, realizing he faced not a family, but a network woven into society itself. The Hollowell discovery had been horrific, but the web uncovered now dwarfed it. The county was entangled in complicity, its pillars corrupted, and the sheriff knew he had stepped into a war not easily won. What began as whispers about wagons and cries in the night had become a revelation of systemic betrayal. The Hollowells were predators, yes, but they were only one head of a many-headed beast. And so the county braced for reckoning. Fathers prayed with clenched fists, deputies sharpened resolve, and the sheriff prepared to drag every hidden name into daylight. The web of complicity would no longer remain unseen. The Hollowell facade had shattered, the web of complicity exposed, and the county teetered on the brink. What began as whispers now thundered through every tavern, every farmhouse, every gathering. Silence no longer protected anyone. The sheriff called a public assembly. Men crowded the square, their breath visible in cold air, their eyes fixed on the courthouse steps. For the first time, the truth would be spoken openly. The ledger was read aloud, each entry heavy as stone. Fathers listened in silence, knuckles white, jaws clenched. Names once spoken with respect were revealed as accomplices. Reputation crumbled in the face of inked truth. The Hollowells stood chained, their composure unnerving. Ezra kept his chin high, his sons rigid at his sides. Their silence mocked the crowd, as if daring anyone to truly hold them accountable. Then came Whitlock's name. Gasps spread through the square. The landowner once admired as a pillar now revealed as a predator's ally. Men shouted in anger, others fell silent, unable to reconcile betrayal with memory. The sheriff stood firm. He declared no man above justice, not Hollowells, not Whitlock, not any judge or merchant entangled in the web. His words shook the square, defiance against corruption itself. Arrests followed swiftly. Deputies stormed estates, seizing ledgers, crates, and contracts. Men of wealth were dragged through mud as villagers watched. Expressions hardened. The machine that thrived in shadows collapsed when exposed to daylight, but exposure came at a cost. Fires erupted across the county, barns torched, evidence destroyed. Retaliation was swift and merciless. The network fought desperately, determined to silence truth before it spread further. The sheriff barely escaped an ambush on a country road. His deputy fell beside him, riddled with musket fire. The funeral drew the town once more, grief mingling with rage until voices demanded blood. Trials began under heavy guard. Witnesses testified. Fathers spoke of missing sons. Deputies revealed findings. The courtroom became a stage where darkness was dragged into light, each word stripping power from those once untouchable. Ezra spoke finally, his voice calm, his words chilling. He claimed innocence, insisted enemies conspired to ruin him. But the ledger betrayed him. The cellar testified louder than his denials, the boy's scars undeniable proof. The Hollowell sons glared at villagers, their silence venomous. Some men muttered that arrogance still lingered in their eyes, a belief that wealth or allies might yet shield them from the noose. Verdicts came swiftly. Guilty on all counts. The Hollowells were sentenced to hang, their estates seized, their legacy destroyed. The crowd erupted, some in relief, others in anger that justice had taken so long. Whitlock's trial followed, more complex, more dangerous. His allies still held influence, but the evidence was overwhelming. Ledgers, crates, testimony. His empire collapsed beneath the weight of truth, his name cursed in every tavern. When Whitlock was sentenced, the county shook with cheers and curses alike. Men felt both vindication and betrayal. To see pillars fall was justice, but it also proved how deep corruption had rotted their world. Executions drew crowds. Fathers watched with solemn faces. Deputies stood guard. Villagers whispered prayers. Ezra Hollowell met death with cold defiance, his sons with silence. The gallows ended their line, but not the scars they left. Whitlock's hanging was slower, more public. Men spat, others turned away, unable to watch. His death symbolized not just punishment, but reckoning, proof that even the most powerful could not outrun truth forever. Afterward, the county stood changed. Taverns buzzed with reflection, fields echoed with silence. Men realized they had lived blind for years, praising benefactors who hid cruelty beneath charity. Trust would never return as easily. The boys rescued from the cellar remained haunted. Some found fathers, others were taken in by neighbors. Their scars were reminders that justice had come too late for many, and survival was its own punishment. The sheriff carried the burden heavier than any. Victory felt hollow. Though justice prevailed, he knew countless others had vanished before discovery. His nights were restless, his conscience forever weighed down by shadows. The county tried to rebuild. Fields were sown, churches repaired, markets reopened. But beneath every handshake, suspicion lingered. Men looked at neighbors with caution, knowing complicity had worn the mask of friendship too easily. Stories spread beyond county lines. Travelers carried word of the Hollowell scandal, of boys freed, of conspiracies exposed. Other communities began to whisper uneasily, wondering what darkness lay beneath their own polished estates. The government sent inquiries, promises of wider investigations, yet men doubted how deep officials would dig, fearing corruption reached farther than anyone admitted. The Hollowells were gone, but the machine might yet survive elsewhere. Still, justice mattered. Fathers felt vindicated, knowing their whispers had not been madness. They had spoken truth against power, and though years were lost, their persistence tore away the facade of invincibility. The Hollowell estate was abandoned, its walls left to rot. Villagers avoided its gates, swearing the soil itself reeked of sin. Over time, nature claimed it, vines crawling across stone, burying cruelty beneath silence. But memory endured. Fathers told sons the story of whispers, of courage, of justice. They warned never to trust facades too easily, never to let fear silence voices crying from shadows. The sheriff aged quickly, hair graying, eyes weary. Men still respected him, but he carried sorrow like armor. He had fought corruption, but at a price etched into his face permanently. Years later, villagers still gathered around tavern fires, retelling the story. Some remembered anger, others sorrow, all remembered betrayal. The Hollowells had fallen, but their memory lingered like a scar across the land. The boys who survived grew into men marked by past chains. Some built lives quietly, others wandered. Their existence was testimony stronger than words, each scarred face a reminder of what was uncovered. The county moved on but never truly healed. Trust fractured, institutions doubted, reputations hollow. Whispers continued, not of Hollowells, but of vigilance, reminders that evil often hides in plain sight, wearing masks of generosity. The gallows that ended Hollowell lives stood for years as monument. Men pointed to it as warning, a wooden shadow reminding all that silence enables cruelty, but defiance brings reckoning, however late it arrives. The sheriff died in his sleep years later, his ledger of notes still locked beside his bed. Villagers buried him as hero, though he never called himself one. His battle was survival, not glory. Legends formed. Fathers told sons how whispers became weapons, how truth emerged from shadows. The Hollowell story passed down not as history alone, but as warning. Never trust wealth without question. Never ignore uneasy silence. And so the county lived on. The Hollowells gone, Whitlock gone, yet their shadows lingered. The reckoning had come, but the lesson remained eternal, that cruelty hides best behind respectability, and justice demands courage to confront it. The story closed, but not neatly. For even as gallows rotted, memories burned. Whispers still carried through taverns and fields, warning each generation that silence is complicity and vigilance the only safeguard against hidden cruelty.